Hello, and welcome to this episode of Midlife Men with me, Philip Briscoe. This episode, I'm joined by Shawn Bergeth. I'm very excited to have him on. I should say, during our prep call, we had a fascinating discussion talking about Shawn's approach to the environment, how he works with people, and talking about his journeys, and including, looking at things like psychedelic-assisted therapy. So I'm sure everyone listening is going to be really interested in him. We've got to say, Shawn. So welcome, and I'll hand over straight to you. Actually, perhaps you could start. Where does your journey begin?
Yeah. So, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I've recently kind of began a second career. I spent 25 years in corporate America working primarily in supply chain, and a few years ago, kind of out of the blue, my role at a large retailer was eliminated kind of out of the blue. And even when I was receiving the news that my job was being eliminated, I knew I was receiving a gift. This is 5 years ago, mind you. And I knew I was receiving a gift. I just didn't at that time quite understand the nature of that gift. Just on a personal mental health aside, approximately 15 years ago, I started addressing my own challenges with depression and anxiety by seeing a therapist, by seeking medication. And I joke that my relationship with my personal therapist is almost longer than anyone in my life beyond my nuclear family. I've been seeing the same therapist since 2009. I see him every week, and I can't quite imagine having that support in my life, both for me personally and to aid me in my current work as a psychotherapist. So in 2021, I started a master's in social work program with the intent of becoming a therapist myself. And I finished that degree a little over a year ago, and I currently practice under what's called supervision at a small private practice in the Twin Cities of Minnesota.
So going back to when you first started to address your own mental health issues, what made you decide to bite the bullet and actually proactively go and find some help? What was that tipping point?
It was during my first marriage. So I've been married, divorced, and since remarried. But it was during my first marriage, which I often describe my first marriage was a mirror. And I was not prepared to see myself in the mirror. And that relationship prompted me to just begin to understand, initially just on the surface, just how much I was struggling with my own mental health. And so really my marriage and she and I had started marital counseling, and that made it clear to me that seeking some individual support would likely be helpful. And little did I know how helpful it would be.
And so from there, did this give you an interest from a professional perspective? Did you start to think at that point, well, actually, I could see myself doing something like this? I guess you had years to go still working in your supply chain job.
Yeah, but it was really clear even 10 years ago, maybe even longer, that there are whispers of like, there's parts of the jobs that you've had that you really don't enjoy. And as those whispers began in my mind, it already kind of made up a narrative that the hurdles were too high, like going back to school for 2 years, working under supervised practice wasn't reasonable. And then of course, income, like, I'm not going to make as much money as a therapist as I was, working as a leader in corporate America. But yeah, those whispers were present, and I think they eventually became shouts. And I don't know, the universe works in mysterious and beautiful ways. And, losing my job was just a shove. It was just a kick in the ass that in retrospect, I really needed that. And I'm grateful for it at this point. And as I mentioned, there's a part of me that was grateful for it, even as I was getting the news, 'cause I knew there's something good on the other side of whatever this hurdle was or wasn't.
So you've been made redundant, you've lost your job and your income. What did you do next?
I rested. I very much rested. And then again, hindsight provides so much clarity, but on some level, I rested for almost 2 years. And during that time, I got to be a dad, stepdad, a husband, a friend, a son, a brother. But I also, in early 2020, by this point, I'd read, Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. And I had a really strong interest in theory of psychedelics and how it may aid people who struggle with various aspects of their mental health. In college, in my early years, I'd had some, experience with psychedelics and kind of I guess a party setting would be the best way to describe it. But eventually I chose to attend a psilocybin mushroom retreat in Jamaica, where there was 11 of us, all from the U.S. that traveled down there for this retreat. It was led by 4 U.S. based therapists.
And how do you find that? I mean, where do you start to look for a retreat like that?
At the time, I think it was just a Google search where I, went and just researched various sites. And there's a website that kind of rates various retreats. And so I referenced that as well and reached out to the retreat I ultimately selected, and had a conversation with one of the therapists who was leading it. And I'm a person I'm deeply intuitive. And at the time, my gut, was like, this is a really good thing. And, at that point, probably my greatest hurdle was trying to explain to my wife what I wanted to do and why I wanted to do it. Her initial response was just like, you want to do what and where? And it's going to cost what? It was, and, she eventually warmed to the idea.
So how does, so you're in Jamaica at this retreat, how do you go about, looking at a psychedelic approach to mental health or other sorts of approaches? What does that look like?
Yeah. And their approach is quite similar to the approach that they've taken at Johns Hopkins University and some of the clinical studies that have been done, where, you're setting a bit of a ceremonial feel to the environment. And, as part of the experience, typically wearing an eye mask to block out, that part of your senses. You're either listening to a curated playlist in the environment, or wearing headphones and listening to music, and you're lying on a mat. And, the music and the eye mask are really kind of forcing you a bit inward, into your experience of the medicine. And, I refer to these things, whether it's psilocybin or some of the other psychedelics, like they're truly medicine. And medicines that have been used in some cases for thousands of years. And, I think we're still uncovering and understanding, the history of some of these compounds and how they've aided humanity in various ways for a very long time.
So I'm assuming you were guided in this process. So perhaps you could kind of explain what that was like, what happened.
Yeah. And the guided piece is incredibly important. If you were to tackle one of these things on your own, it's not a good idea. And so having a skilled facilitator or guide is really important. And to your question of what does that mean? It might mean that just that guide, that therapist is simply present. They're just there. That they're there should you need support, or, you encounter some distress that you're not able to move through on your own. But it's somebody that's just present for you and has a really deep understanding of what you're going through and what you might experience. And that kind of prompts the question of what are you going through? And, there's a famous neuroscientist by the name of Sam Harris. And one of the things that he articulates is that there's a poverty of words and language to describe what these experiences are. It's broadly psychedelics propel you into a non-ordinary state of consciousness. So it is it can be a very, very intense experience that is confusing. It might not be confusing. There could be, both auditory and visual hallucinations. But you're entering, kind of a part of your unconscious mind, in a way that, no other kind of ordinary state of consciousness is really similar to.
And how does that aid in, if you're suffering from depression, for example, or you're having challenges, how does that help? And I guess there's no single answer for that. What can you expect?
Yeah. I think about the mind is really, really adept at insulating us from really, really difficult or traumatic experiences. Think about people who have endured really significant abuse and at some point in their life or in early childhood. It's not uncommon for individuals to have no conscious recollection of those memories. Unfortunately, that wasn't my experience early in life. But the psychedelic experience often provides a window to begin to explore the parts of ourselves that are suppressed, the parts of ourselves that, we may have difficulty. And, the truth of the matter is that we don't fully understand how these things work. But, one of the things that Michael Pollan references in his book is the concept of neuroplasticity, which is essentially just the degree to which, we've got kind of embedded habits or, patterns in our brain that, cause us to kind of get stuck in certain ways. And probably addiction is the best example of this, where in a way we develop ruts in our brain that are just there are ways of behavior that are really, really difficult to overcome. And he describes how, an intense psychedelic experience can be like a fresh coat of snow, over a mountain that covers up, the ruts and provides the opportunity to develop, new neural pathways, which enable us, to tackle aspects of our behavior that, have negatively impacted our mental health. And I think we know part of how that happens is that, psychedelics, can accelerate neural growth and, creating opportunities for neurogenesis, for really actual physical changes in our brain. But like I said, these are, somewhat poorly understood. And yet we know that in some of the trials, people, will report that a psychedelic experience is in the top 5, spiritual experiences of their life. And about 3/4 of, and some of these studies reflect that 75% of people report that to be true. So it's a really powerful, modality that, is still kind of gaining traction and acceptance in the world. And, I think about, being a child in the 80s and, this is your brain on drugs, and mushrooms are drugs. And, these things are really toxic and to be avoided at all costs. So there's significant cultural headwinds, I think probably not just in the US, but throughout the world, that, these compounds have no redeeming medical, or societal value.
So you had this experience, you went to this retreat in Jamaica, and then presumably you came home. So how did that kind of help guide you on your next part of the journey?
It's a really good question. I've struggled with anxiety my whole life. And, I returned from Jamaica as the pandemic was hitting. So this is March of 2020. And, there was a lot of fear in the world. My kids were obviously much younger then, and we were migrating to, remote, distance learning from home. And there was a lot of chaos in the world, and I had never felt so calm and grounded in my life. Um, and from there, during that retreat, it was very, very clear that the path for me was to pursue a new career in mental health. But it still took me several months to apply to schools and eventually enroll in a program and begin that process. But it was pretty rapid after I returned, and um, ultimately I started my master's program in the fall of 21 the following year. Kind of going back to, like, in a way, I rested for 2 years. And that took me a while to even acknowledge of, like, oh, well, who rests for that long? But I think my career took more out of me than I really recognized. And I needed the time of rest and reflection and really anchoring back to the things that were most important in my life.
I think, speaking to other men, I think there's a lot that's lost when you think, right, I'm going to have this career, I'm going to work really hard, study hard at university or college, get into my career, work hard, and ultimately it'll pay off, and I'll have the income I want. I'll be, satisfied personally, professionally. But often that's not the way, is it? I mean, do you think, looking back on your years working in the corporate world, do you think it, did it stymie? Did it suppress perhaps what you think you were born to do? I guess it's difficult to say.
Yeah. Um, for me, it isn't difficult to say. It absolutely did. So I think a part of my journey was just, learning to love and accept myself. And the culture in corporate life, and just in culture more broadly, of never good enough, is so prolific. And, in truth, I think a big part of our economies depend on people having an orientation to themselves of never good enough. And so in my roles in corporate life, the expectations of, like, oh, well, this is what you achieved this quarter, but you got to do better next quarter, next year. Like, never good enough was always a theme, of, like, my responsibilities and the teams that I led. But that attached really readily to just this deep seated fear in me that I wasn't good enough. And so, I think, having participated in that model for so long, in a way that became a part of my identity of not being good enough. And so for me, almost by definition, it really didn't permit kind of me to come forward, because I was operating from a place of fear that, these deeply held views were actually true, and outside environment really validated it. My insecurities and my inability to love and accept myself was, this might be a little bit, like, over the top, but in a way, the environments that I worked in exploited something that already existed within me.
So I know that you went to Jamaica, but you're interested in looking at kind of alternative or the use of psychedelic approaches to therapy. I know that you've been on other retreats as well, which have just kind of furthered your educational interest, I guess. I wonder if you could talk a bit about those.
Yeah. So halfway through my master's program, had kind of a serendipitous opportunity to travel deep into the jungles of Peru for 2 weeks on an ayahuasca retreat. And it was interesting because, I was familiar with ayahuasca. It's arguably one of the most powerful psychedelic substances on the planet. And it wasn't really high on my list of priorities, but I was introduced via an acquaintance in my hometown to an individual who had a passion for, psychedelics as it applies to the world of mental health, and it just became really clear that this is something not to explore. And so during just short of 2 weeks in the jungle of Peru, I attended a retreat called Casa del Maestro, and met Maestro Alberto, who is the ayahuasquero, the shaman, who led this retreat. And this is an individual who has worked in this capacity in his community and his culture since he was a very young boy. So ultimately participated in 5 ceremonies over the course of 6 days. Ceremony happened in the evening. It began at 8 o'clock. And it took place in a building called the Maloka. A Maloka is a circular building that, is utilized for this purpose. And, ceremony, ayahuasca itself is kind of a tea. You ingest a relatively small amount of it. Doesn't taste particularly good. And the amount that you drink, you kind of decide that, on your own and in concert with the shaman, in this case, Maestro Alberto. And Maestro would lead ceremony along with one or more of his sons, along with a couple of other facilitators. And in this case, where I was at, it was one of which was an American from upstate New York, and another who was a Russian, from originally from Siberia. And so really a panel of like facilitators or therapists in a way, I guess, in the kind of put it in, kind of Western language. And the interesting part about ayahuasca is that they are ingesting the medicine with you. And it lasts anywhere from 2 to 5 hours. It just kind of depends. And the piece about ayahuasca that's different is that the experience, or at least my experiences were that the shamans kind of lead the intensity of the experience, and they seem to play a role in what takes place in ceremony. And as I explored that with them afterwards, like, they're in contact with the spirits that are present among us. And and some people are sitting in chairs around the circumference of the Maloka, which is circular. Others might be, lying on mattresses in the middle of the Maloka. And again, it's an intense inward journey. It's dark. You're not wearing eye mask, but it's dark. You can't see a whole lot. And, one of the things that struck me is just the profound stillness of the experience. The Maestro Alberto and those leading it are singing songs, and at times they would break from their what they call icaros, which are the specific songs that they sing in ceremony. And at times they would stop and just be silent for a bit, and then you would just hear the sounds of the jungle. And so often it felt like everything in the jungle was like in the Maloka with you, and that everything was, working in concert with one another to make this experience what it was. And if I think about what I avoided so much in my life prior to kind of starting this journey, it was just stillness and being with myself and being alone with my thoughts, sometimes thoughts that were dark and intrusive and scary. And I just think it's awesome even just to hear dogs barking in the background, because it's like, it might be like, this is an interruption. No, it's just everything's working together and everything's as it is. And how do we accept what's taking place in this moment without judgment, without trying to change it, without, all the, I don't know, all the sideways thoughts that kind of get in our way and prompt anxiety and fear and distress.
And so do you feel it profoundly changes you, or profoundly changes the way that you view yourself and the way that you go out in the world?
Yeah. And I would say the most profound experience I had was my 4th night in the Maloka. And my dad passed away in January of 2015. And I always knew that my dad suffered with something that he never described to me in the time on Earth. And that 4th night, I spent with him, and in a way, I relived some of the traumatic experiences that he experienced. honestly, it was the most challenging experience of my life. I was begging God for, to end this experience because of how afraid I was. In the middle of the experience, I didn't know what it was about. Um, and, towards the end, I realized what it was and who it was about. It was about my dad. And I felt his physical presence that night in a way that was not unlike when he was alive and when he hugged me and told me that he was proud of me. And that fundamentally changed me as a human being. And I know that my dad is present with me every day in the work that I do and in my life and my relationships. And it, yeah, it changed me. And in a way it didn't change me. It just connected me to my own authenticity and who I am. And in many respects, like that, it just kind of furthered what was already in place in terms of just my perception of how these substances can help us. It really kind of cracked my heart open and anchored me to a sense of interconnectedness and spirituality that I didn't have before. And I think that's a common thread in all psychedelics, but one that was most profound for me when I was in Peru is that, as people, as human beings, we're all deeply interconnected in ways that, in some ways are really clear and in other ways are really subtle. And then it also connected me to just nature and, all things in our environment, whether that's living things like trees or, outside my window here, or rocks, or, just everything that makes up the earth. And I've always been very kind of connected to trees. And part of the traditions of the Peruvian people and this medicine, all the trees, all the plants, have spirits, and spirits that are, able to help us and to provide clarity and how we're connected to them and one another. And part of that is that it just kind of, I don't know, it intensified my connection with nature. And, I like to go into northern Minnesota, into the wilderness by myself for short periods of time, and just to go be with the trees in a way. And that, I think, today we have all these, pharmaceutical approaches to mental health, but we're so far away from, I have this theory that maybe, 1,000 years ago, a medicine person in a culture, might prescribe, go to the woods for 2 weeks by yourself and come back and you will be healed. And, I think that's a part of what, we're trying to get back to, that we're trying to learn about and understand as it relates to struggles that people have today.
And we're quite far. We're not very connected from that, are we? Some people are, some cultures are, but certainly I'd say most people listening to this in the US or North America or in the UK and Europe are probably not experiencing that sort of connection with nature, or rarely. So do you, and I appreciate you're practicing under supervision at the moment, but your approach then when working with patients, is it to explore this idea that you need to connect more with nature to help heal yourself and make sense of your mental health challenges?
Yeah, it certainly can be. And, so much of it depends on where someone's at and what their current relationship is with the world around them. But it's interesting, in my office, the windows in my office kind of face, trees, and then beyond the trees is a pond and some water. And I know that in a way, these trees that are outside my office, like, they help me. They help the work that's going on in my office. And it's funny, as I say these things, like, if the me of 3 or 4 years ago heard me speak, I would say I'm nuts. I'm kind of, I'm way out in left field. And yet, um, it's a function of what I've learned. And so, with some of my clients that I work with, will I reference how I believe the trees are helping us in that room? Absolutely. Um, and, encouraging individuals to go for a walk in nature is something, I suggest all the time. And with my colleagues in the office, we often kind of joke or speculate that if all of our clients went for a 30-minute walk outside every day, our business would collapse, and that's probably a bit of an exaggeration. And I don't want to oversimplify the challenges that people face, but, um, movement and nature, I think they're a part of what can just naturally connect us back to ourselves. And that's always been true. And I don't believe will ever not be true.
And aren't there, connections, underground connections between kind of ecosystems, especially microbial and trees and other sorts of vegetation that we don't see?
Yeah, I mean, you're referencing something I think underpins all of it is that, you know, mycelium, which is the precursor to the fruits that eventually become fungi and mushrooms, essentially cover the earth. And they are kind of the original internet, and they are the pathways by which nature might communicate to, redirect resources to a plant or a tree that might be struggling. And, we're learning that, plant life is in fact intelligent. And I think that's part of how connection with nature helps us heal. Going out and, walking on the earth without shoes and just putting your feet, in the earth, I think is something that can be really grounding and really powerful. In fact, as I prepare for sessions with clients, sometimes I will visualize, anchoring myself back to the earth, back to the very core of the earth, visualize my feet walking in the grass, walking in the woods, just to ground myself so I'm better equipped to support those that I'm working with. But I think there is an intelligence, and, um, you know, uh, the more open we are to it, I think the more access we have, to the power that this is. And I don't know. I think our systems are such that, these concepts seem a little woo woo or out there, but they also aren't, they're not a source of revenue. And, the never good enough piece is so hyper connected to, you know, to money, to resources, and kind of separating us from this never good enough and connecting us back to ourselves and the world that surrounds us.
And it's relatively recent, really, isn't it? In the if you look at the timeline of humans on this planet, it's only relatively recently that I guess a lot of people have lost that connection.
I think about it as like, well, there's a cost to everything. And with all these technological advances and, these phones that we're all connected to, and there's a lot of really positive, parts to these like innovations, but there's also a cost. And, I think, we're developing a different awareness of what the costs are of not being in connection in relationship with people, spending time in person with people versus connecting on social media or via text or things of that nature. Or even there's a lot of people that don't even want a phone call anymore, and like, not only do we need phone calls, but we need physical contact. We need to hug. We need to see the whites of one another's eyes and be in connection and community with others. I think, overarching all this is that we heal in relationship. Don't heal in isolation. It's not possible.
So, and you already are, but what kind of advice would you give to somebody that's perhaps listening to this, feeling that they're unfulfilled, perhaps in their career at work, or just generally feeling anxious or depressed or stressed? Now, what's a kind of easy fix that they can just go and do themselves?
I don't know that there's an easy fix, but the word that comes to mind when I think about, you know, advice is vulnerability. And that is like, how do you kind of identify what it is that's causing distress? And how do you find someone that you trust to be vulnerable with? And, I'm a therapist, but like there's so many experiences in life that are therapy. Like going and having coffee or tea with a friend and be like, you know what, I need somebody to talk to about something. I've really been struggling with my relationship with my partner or with my children, with myself. That's therapy. Like going and walking in the woods is therapy. Um, and so I would say find a way to identify what's happening and take that first step to be vulnerable with another human being who you trust. And that doesn't have to be a therapist. It doesn't have to be, there's no requirements other than find someone that you trust. Because I think particularly for men, there's these hurdles about what is therapy and what does that mean about me as a man, as a human being? Is this a sign of weakness? Is this a sign of strength? But I think that would be it, of like, find someone that you're comfortable to talk to about the things that are distressing us.
Or group, I guess, like the Face It Foundation. Well, thank you, Shawn. That's been really fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you or someone you know is struggling with depression, the Face It organisation can be found at faceitfoundation.org, or you can email Mark at info@faceitfoundation.org. There are also organisations you can call now. For example, in the UK, you can call the Samaritans on 116 123. And if you're listening in the US, you can call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you have a story to tell and you think your experience would help others, then please get in contact with me, either via the website, mid-lifemen.com, or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Finally, please share the podcast with people you know and with your networks. And if you enjoy listening, then please rate or like the podcast. It helps raise its profile and helps reach more people who might benefit from the stories shared by my guests.